Hey everyone, Adrian here. Here's a time-lapse of the line art stage of a previous commission. Among questions I've been asked, how I think about and handle line art is one of them, so here's an opportune moment to take a good example and give a sort of run through my general thought process. First thing with this, though also the first thing I tend towards working on, is the structure of the face, though since this guy is mostly face, so to speak, that blends in working on the whole body. I often try to work outside in, worrying about the smaller details later after handling broader strokes. After getting the core frame largely taken care of, then I start going around and tending to the extra features that are hanging around in front of other parts, in particular nailing down the shapes of grass sticking out and kind of layering them. You'll see that I jump about a little bit, mostly thinking a little bit ahead on things I want to start shaping, like the forward leg, though not detailing it much yet. Sometimes I just want to get something up to a point that I can start visualizing what elements that I won't need to worry about as much and go off into a satisfactory point that leaves me comfortable changing focus for a little bit. A big thing to remember about a whole line art or inking process is that it's not about tracing over your sketch so much. It's finding the most ideal strokes to summarize the essence of the sketch. Knowing that you're going to be losing a fair chunk of the initial energy and randomness that went into that first step, and now building a solid foundation out of it that will hold the remainder of the piece together. With the arm and hand here, there's a bit of temptation to think of them as just a bunch of cylinders, but I found it much more efficient to conceptualize them like a series of increasingly slightly larger spheres, or later especially for the purposes of perspective. Pushing that visually a bit further also includes going over the structure of the hand with some more extra lines to thicken them, as boulder weighted lines can suggest either shadows and a distance from a light source, or closer proximity. Also, something to always remember, abuse of layers and selections are the best for creating and cutting out shapes with a much lesser amount of hassle. Keep things simple. As you can see though, even though I've theoretically finished certain parts, dissatisfaction regularly kicks in, and I go back and try and readdress elements until I feel they're much more in line with the shapes I want to convey. Don't get too precious with your lines, because sometimes for the sake of a better image, you'll have to sacrifice that earlier work. So with a lot of the more complex elements taken care of, I started diving into the smaller, more nuanced features, cutting away at shapes like the leaves, and started to actually work on the face proper. As mentioned earlier, I tend to handle the face first, as extremely important as they are to any kind of depiction, but this time I felt it better to handle it last. Here I'm often thinking about the supposed textures and starting to use thinner lines for the smaller details. When considering things like markings and patterns, I tend to go half and half with whether or not I actually use line work at all, instead simply favoring the color work to handle those steps entirely, particularly for more natural organic markings like spots, stripes, or like scars, etc. But other times they're far more integral to the design, like here, and actually drawing out the markings within the line art was the best option. Lastly comes the board, which for this character also is primarily his little weapon that fits in his hand. First thing to be seriously noted is that while the background is going to be all water, and technically elements of the board are going to be submerged with some forms of effects and all, drawing the whole thing is important so there is room to play. I try not to draw only a portion of things like that unless I'm absolutely dead certain that they're not going to be potentially moved around in some form. Equally important is because the amount of overlapping features, with the teeth tied to the edges, instead of actually erasing the hidden parts, I find it safer to use a layer mask and just hide said parts again, just in case I need room to adjust and save the trouble of more work. I think that pretty well covers this example of how I think about lines. Hopefully I maybe gave you things to consider, of course adaptable to your own style. Next week there will be a full time lapse of another piece, then the next 2 weeks will be the monthly Dracon headshots, then full body drawing, so look forward to those. Of course, let me know what you want to see more, or even what you want to see less of. Don't forget to check in the description below for a link to the final piece and more. If you want to support further creation of videos like this, subscribe, hit the notification bell below, and consider donating to my Ko-fi. Until then, catch y'all next time.